Going to the next speaker. He's already in the backstage looking at me. He's pumped. He's like, Marnik, let me do this. I've been watching there. He's waving at me. He's like, I've been waiting for this all day. I'm ready to go. So I won't take too much of your time. Here we go. He's going to talk about his calling presentation, and he's already sharing it, which is really cool. Makes things go smooth. And by the way, if you're switching, now's the time to switch. I don't want you to switch. Of course, I want you to stay for Marius. But if you're like, the other stream is more relevant for me, now is the time to do that. Go to the lobby, go to stream 2. And if you're like, I'm good, I'm comfortable, Marnik, this is exactly what I want to hear. This is the right place. And like I said in the chat, you can engage with us if you have any questions. The presentation is called Building SaaS Applications on AWS, talking about the benefits of architecting applications as SaaS. And the person who better to share this with us than the Senior Partner Solution Architect at AWS. And here we go again for the name pronunciation, Marius Cealera. You can correct me.
Good attempt. Good attempt.
Good attempt. Good attempt.
Yeah.
Is it Marius Cealera?
It's Cealera, but again, that was pretty good.
All right, cool. I'm just going to call you, like I said, with Anna Maria, Marius. What's the challenging names in this afternoon here? Marius, you look ready. You have the presentation. It's sharing. Everything's good. So give me a thumbs up if everything's okay. There you go. So ladies and gentlemen, give him digital applause and all your attention and love. Marius Cealera. Here we go. Take it away. Have fun.
Yeah, thank you. And so hello, good morning, good afternoon, whatever your time zone may be. As mentioned, my name is Marius Cealera. I'm a senior solutions architect with AWS. I've been working with AWS for a bit over 2 years now. And part of my day-to-day job is supporting customers create cloud-native apps or to migrate existing or legacy apps to the cloud. And in that context, software as a service or SaaS is one topic that comes up very often, which makes me very happy, right? SaaS is a topic very close to my heart. I am coming from a software development background, and I found the transition to software as a service, right, to be very fulfilling for me as a developer, of course, for my customers, my users, but for the business as well, right? So with that, I'll just say I'm very excited to talk about SaaS today at OpenSlava, of course, virtual this year, unfortunately, but it is what it is. Now, full disclaimer, this is the first time I'm trying to deliver this session in 30 minutes or less. And SaaS is a big topic, right? We could probably spend days, if not weeks, discussing it. But we only have 30 minutes. So I want to focus on a few items today. I'll start with a very brief introduction and what it means to run software as a service, with that as a service part being the key part. Then I'll also go over 3 areas that I think are key in any SaaS discussion, right? The control plane, tenancy, and multi-tenancy to be exact, and identity and isolation. And I'll explain what these concepts refer to and why they are important. And finally, I'll provide a brief description of a tool we call AWS SaaS Boost, which you can use to quickly transform existing or maybe older applications to software as a service solutions. Okay, so let's jump straight into it. So what is SaaS? That's a loaded question, of course. Plenty of definitions depending on where you look or who you ask. And I remember trying to explain this at some point to my mother, and they say that you don't really know something unless you can explain it to a child, to a 10-year-old. And when it comes to technology, my mother is probably, it's probably worse with technology than a child. Anyway, what I told her is that, software as a service, it's not a technology, right? It's not a technology stack. Probably the definition I like the most is, it's a model, it's a business model, or maybe a licensing model, right? It's a model that businesses are moving to for more efficiency, right? More users, more customers, better customer adoption, and in general, a better customer experience, right? And that model, core to that model is agility, right? Agility to deliver new features, to change the direction of the solution, right? To onboard customers and so on. And that agility generally comes from efficiency. And efficiency, again, you can think of efficiency at the infrastructure level, right? Efficiency in operations, efficiency in how you present the entire experience to your customers, so they don't need, documentation or any other support to start using the solution. And that efficiency, all of those things, that translates into what we call a reduced cycle time. So what that means is from the moment when you think of a new feature, right, for your product, you have the idea, and the moment when that idea is in the hands of the customer and they start using it and you get feedback, you reduce that from possibly weeks, months, to something that can be even minutes, right? And of course that leads to innovation, right? You can put out more features, you get the feedback, you put again new features, and you expand the product, and you make the customers happy. And of course that means growth, you get more customers, and of course the business is doing good as well. So with all of that in mind, I think you'll see what I'm trying to say, especially with this next slide, that you're no longer looking at an application as a product, right? You're no longer building a product, you're building a service, right? And I think that's the main hurdle that businesses have when they transition into SaaS, software as a service, is that change in mindset that, typically product managers think about a product and they have like a list of features, right? And maybe they position the product in the market, and maybe they compare that product or app with competitors and they compare that list of features. In any case, it's very product focused, right? Whereas with SaaS, you need to build a bit on that, because you no longer have the product, you have a service, right? You own the end-to-end, let's say, experience. Right, so that from the customer perspective, that means, how do I get to use the product? How fast can I ramp up with that product? How do I provide feedback, right? So it's an entire experience that you now own as a service provider. And of course, you need to operate the product, right? You need to run it. If in the past you would develop it, you would package it, and then you just, you would sell it to a customer and they would operate it. Now you actually need to run that and own that part as well, right? So again, transition from product to service is very important when you are architecting SaaS solutions. Just to add a bit, so you can have this idea of how you approach this entire thing. I really like this diagram, because if you look at these circles from the outside in, right, you first need to make sure that whatever you're building, you can operate it, right? You should start with that. It should not be an afterthought. It should not be, let's just do the product and then we'll figure it out, right? How we run it as a service. It's better to do it the other way around, right? Think how you operate it, right? How you will get customers on your platform, on your app, right? How you will manage the deployments, the provisioning of infrastructure, and all of that. Think of it as a restaurant, right? It's a bit of a cliche comparison, but it works, right? So you have a restaurant and you make the best pie in town, right? The pie is the product. if the location is bad, the location of the restaurant, or if the if the waiters are bad, the service is bad, it won't really matter if you have the best pie, right? You can sell it online, right? Or you can do other things with your pie. That's fine. But if that service layer is lacking, then the product is affected as well. So start with that layer, right? And then, of course, it's how you build it. Build it right. Doesn't matter what you build. There are some patterns, and we will go over them. There are some patterns you need to keep in mind, like tenancy, right? Multi-tenancy and data partitioning, and how you isolate tenants. And by the way, tenants are customers, right? In the SaaS vocabulary. Think of a tenant as a customer, right? And then, of course, finally, you need to build the right thing, the actual product. But I guess the point of this is that's only a part. Building the right product is only a part of the full story with SaaS, right? You need to make sure you have the other layers as well. So, okay, all that is great, right? But how do you actually build something, right? If you want to build something, what are the specific components that that you need to design for? And it's mostly the blue components that you see in here, right? The gray box in the middle, that's important as well. But hear me out, right? The blue components on this slide is what allows you to put your product in front of the customer as a service, right? And operate it as a service while also maintaining those agility and efficiency benefits, right? So this is what we call the control plane. And the control plane is the way that you bring in new customers, new tenants, you manage them, you do your monitoring, you aggregate logs, you aggregate metrics, you do billing, right? You provision infrastructure. All of that is what we call the control plane. And, of course, what you have in the middle there, that's important as well. But with a really good control plane, you can put a lot of things, a lot of products and architectures in the middle, and you can still call yourself, SaaS, software as a service. Related to this, you'll say, well, what about managed service providers, right? MSPs. From the customer's perspective, they also provide the service, right? And they don't necessarily have a control plane. Why aren't they SaaS providers? And the reason is, they don't standardize. They don't have that control plane to have everything standardized, right? They may have customers on different product versions. They may have different teams taking care of different customers. They may have customizations and so on and so forth. But they're lacking that, what we call the common control plane for all tenants, right? And the reason why that's important, again, is with an MSP, you do show a service to the customer, but you don't have that efficiency that we discussed at the very beginning, right? You don't have the agility. So you don't have all the benefits that should come with software as a service. So yeah, those are just a few words on the importance of this control plane and how that can define if you are actually running your solution as SaaS or not. But let's also discuss about that part in the middle, right? And what you need to look at when you're designing that. And now we get into the tenancy, right? The concept of tenancy and multi-tenancy. And again, a tenant is a customer, right? Think of it like that. So you'll see normally 3 big patterns here when it comes to designing SaaS solutions. The first one is what we call a silo, right? And this is where, every tenant, every customer, they have their own dedicated infrastructure, their own stack just for them. From the front end, the compute layer, the data layer, it's theirs, and other tenants don't have access to it, right? And you'll say, well, this doesn't really sound like SaaS, right? There's no infrastructure sharing here. And again, that control plane is where it's at, right? You can deploy your application like this. You can have a siloed tenancy model, right? If you have the control plane in place to make it work, this can still be a valid SaaS offering, right? Yes, you will trade some cost benefits, right? You'll trade some cost benefits. Your deployments may be a bit more complex. You'll need to aggregate logs and metrics across different infrastructure, but you do gain security, compliance. Some customers will demand that they have their own separate database, right? So you do gain some benefits. It's a trade-off, right? But as long as you have that control plane in place to manage everything in a unified manner, right? Then this is a valid approach to a SaaS solution. So that's silo. Then we have the pool model, which is the other extreme. And in this model, you are basically, you are sharing infrastructure across tenants. You have the same compute, the same data layer. Imagine customer A, customer B, they may go through the same container instance, right? Or VM or Lambda function, right? Serverless, whatever you have for compute. And they will then fetch data or write data to the same database instance, right? In some cases, even the same database table. Of course, that's where you get all the cost benefits, economies of scale, and you only have one big app to manage, right, and to deploy to. But it's also a lot more risky, right? If you mess up a deployment or if something fails, then of course, all your customers, all your tenants are affected. So, you need to be quite good at that operational side if you plan to go this way. And of course, security is a lot more complex here as well. And tenant isolation is a bit more complex. And we'll touch a bit on that in a few minutes. But yeah, so this is the pool model. And in between is what is a bit of both, right? The hybrid or the bridge model, where you may want to have your front end, for example, shared by all customers, maybe even your compute layer. But you'll then say, you know what, I want each customer to have their own database, right? So this is a bit of a mix of both. So pros and cons. Again, this depends on the context, right, and what the business is trying to achieve, and in some cases, compliance and security considerations. But at a very high level, with the silo model, compliance is always easier. Compliance people like this model. It's simple, right? It's pretty simple to understand, and that barrier between tenants is very clear, right? Of course, the downside is you're not making the best of it. You're not really reaching that full promise of what a software as a service application should deliver. But in some cases, there may be no choice. You simply need, as I said, to have dedicated infrastructure for every customer. And this is especially true for for enterprise customers, for B2B situations, right? Whereas with the pool model, it's a bit of a reverse story, right? You gain everything you lose with the silo model, but now you have cross-tenant issues, security issues, data partitioning issues to deal with, right? It's not impossible, of course. It's just more complex, right? But there is a payoff, you get cost optimizations, agility, you deploy to a single target, right? So it's an interesting discussion, and most most cases I've seen usually start with a silo model, and then gradually they tend to transition to a pooled model, going through that hybrid stage in between, right? So they start with siloed tenancy, and at some point they will say, you know what, we will share the front end across all tenants. And then maybe a bit later down the road, we will also share the compute layer. And usually the last one is the data layer, right? That gets shared across tenants. So let's talk a bit about that, about isolation, right? Tenant isolation. This is, the main purpose of tenant isolation is that tenant A doesn't have access to tenant B's data, right, or vice versa. So the main purpose, it comes from a security and a compliance consideration, right? You don't want that. That is really bad. But that's that's one thing. The other thing that you want to achieve with tenant isolation is you want to reduce the noisy neighbor effect, right? So especially with shared infrastructure, imagine you have two customers using your application, and they're using a shared I don't know, VM, database instance, whatever. And one of the tenants is using 80% of the CPU, right, on that resource. The other tenant using it may see performance issues, right, or even availability issues. Isolation should address that as well, right? So not only the security part, but also the noisy neighbor effect part. And there are a few strategies to achieve this. With a siloed tenancy, right, that very first scenario we discussed, this is fairly straightforward, right? You have separate infrastructure, so you have a very clear boundary. This can be at an account level, right? If you are deploying this on AWS, you can say, you know what, I'll have a different AWS account for every customer. And my control plane will wrap around all those customers, all the accounts, but every customer will be in their own account, and cross-customer, cross-tenant is very hard to imagine, almost impossible at that point, right? So it's a very hard separation between accounts. Of course, you can also do this at the network level, right, at the VPC level. The VPC in AWS, for those who may not know, is your own personal network in the cloud, right? So there you can have one VPC per tenant, or again, you can go a bit deeper. Within a VPC, you can have a subnet per tenant. The point is, with a siloed tenancy strategy, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty simple to understand where that boundary is. Now, where it gets really interesting, of course, is what do you do if you have a pooled model with shared infrastructure? In this model, you'll notice on this slide, I have there on the right side, in the same table, you can have different rows have data for different customers, right? So it's the boundaries are really quite blurred, are at the detail level, right? In this case, it's no longer at the account level. Everything is mixed, everything is shared. So you can imagine isolation in this scenario becomes a lot more complex. So how would you do it? For this, we need to also bring in the notion of identity. And identity with SaaS solutions is you're not only looking at the end user identity, right? You're also looking at the tenant identity. So think, let's take a classic example. Let's take a Salesforce, right? Salesforce.com. I could have a company. I could register with Salesforce, right? I would be a tenant on Salesforce, but then I would also have my employees, right? That they would have accounts and they would access that tenant. So now I have the user identity, and then I also have a tenant identity, right? And what happens is when that user logs in, I need to know, who that user is, what tenant that user belongs to at a minimum, and maybe also, information about what kind of subscription maybe that user has, right? Is this a premium user? Is this a free tier user, right? So all of that information, user identity, tenant identity, and subscription, all of that, we need to encapsulate that. We call that the context, right? The tenant context. That is usually encapsulated, usually in a token, and that flows downstream with every request you make, right? So imagine this user logging into, and then they make, they want to fetch some data from the database. That request will go initially through maybe an API gateway, right? And then it will go through a container or a serverless compute, and then through the database. And this tenant context flows with it. And this can be done in many different ways, but generally what you do is you take that tenant context, and with it you create a scoped permission, right, or a role, or an access rule. Depending on where you build it, it has different names. But the idea is you take the tenant context and you build the permission based on that. And then that permission, you apply that to your compute layer. So then, that request can only read from a specific table. Or if you have row level security, you say it can only read rows in the database for that tenant, right? So, at a high level, this is how you would manage this in a pooled tenancy model. Now, this is for the data and security part, right? The other side of isolation, right, the noisy neighbor one, it's, at a very high level, it's a similar approach, but now instead of controlling access to data, you control access to infrastructure resources, right? CPU usage, or memory usage, or disk usage, or whatever, right? Similar approach. You need to have that tenant context, and you need to relate that to different infrastructure metrics. Okay, so again, time is a bit short, so I won't go into more details on that. The takeaway here is that no matter what model you end up with, right, you'll still need to always think about that. What does SaaS actually promise, right? That agility, efficiency, reduced cycle, right? And that control plane. That control plane, from my experience, from what I've seen, that one is key, because that's what users will initially experience, right? When they onboard, right? When they pay the subscription, when they ask for support. And also on the operational side, that's where your your operational success will come from. How can you manage all of this? How can you deploy to it? How can you do the logging and the metrics and the billing and so on, right? So with that in mind, what I would like to introduce in these few final minutes that we have is AWS SaaS Boost. And very simply put, what SaaS Boost is a ready-to-use open source reference environment that helps you accelerate transition into SaaS. Right? So basically, it provides that control plane, those onboarding, metering, billing components that you need for the control plane. And what you need to do is, of course, you need to provide the core product. And right now, this is a fairly new offering. Of course, it doesn't cover all scenarios. There are some restrictions. For example, your application needs to be containerized, right? You need to provide it as a container image. But if you have that in place, then through this, through AWS Boost, you can really quickly transform that into a software as a service offering. So the way that works is, how you would do it is, you go to GitHub, you clone the SaaS Boost repo. Again, this is open source. You provision that environment into an AWS account. And then you provide your existing application as a container image. And what SaaS Boost will do is it will provision the tenants, it will manage the tenants, it will do the metrics and all the control plane for you, right? So it will basically transform your app into a SaaS solution. And specifically the way this looks and what it will provision is, it will give you a very simple front end to manage the control plane. It's written in React. It will provision an API gateway, and that will keep the endpoints of all of these different control plane components that are deployed serverless on AWS, so as Lambda function. This is really useful, of course. Being serverless, you only pay for what you use, right? If you're not onboarding anyone, you don't pay for that onboarding component. They're highly available, and all that, all those good things. And of course, you also have with SaaS Boost, as I said, the metrics and analytics part, and also more recently billing. So everything you would need from a control plane to get you started, right? Now, this is just scratching the surface, right? This is just a very high level view, maybe just to give you the right mindset if you start thinking about SaaS. If you'd like to know more, I'll just put 2 links in here. There are many other sources of information, of course. The first one is for SaaS Boost, right? If you want to read more, just Google AWS SaaS Boost. And then the second one is if you want to know more in general about SaaS on AWS, you can follow this link or just Google AWS SaaS Factory. So that's like the central point of knowledge for SaaS on AWS. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to attend this session. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right. Thank you, Marius. I wanted to ask, where can they go if they want to know more about the new SaaS Boost? But then you came with the slide and you're like, if you want to know more, bam, there's where you want to go. So there it goes. Question, due to timing, we're spot on time. So I need to give people 1 or 2 minutes to switch the rooms, but better that you can give them the value than that you quit earlier. So I loved it. And if people want to know more about the SaaS Boost, they can contact you or they can go to the links that you said. I hope you enjoyed talking here on OpenSlava on day 2.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here, Marius, and continue to do the great work. There you
Thank
go.
you for
Thumbs
having
up.
me.
You're
Thanks.
welcome. And we're going straight forward. If you're going to want to switch, now is the time to do it. You go to the lobby, you go to stream 2. If you're like, oh, I want to see that speaker. And if you're like, no, I'm here for Caroline, then stay here in stream 1, because we are going to move forward